Okay, guys. I am so delighted to be joined today by somebody who means a whole lot to me. Somebody who has staked in my personal growth and spared time for honest conversations and dialogues. I know her children well, and I love her children, and I think the world of her. Dr. Vanessa Lapointe, thank you for being here today. Give me one of these.
Awesome.
Good to see you. You doing well?
Yes.
Good. And Stuart? Yeah.
Thank you.
The thing that we were just talking about off camera, Dr. Vanessa, is how before I knew what you did for work and before I knew all of that, I knew you as the loveliest person on the sideline of a rugby field.
Awesome.
And as a coach, that's something I've been doing passively for 10 years and coaching your sons for the last 3. Your character and their character has stayed consistent all the way through. I would like to start there. Consistency. I sometimes struggle in my role as a mentor in my younger side of the experience, keeping myself consistent, keeping expectations consistent, and finding where to start in that one tangible step of how to achieve that consistency. Do you have something that you could bestow upon me or bestow upon somebody looking for that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, particularly in the backdrop of a culture that's about hustle and grind, and we glorify busyness and, all of the things that come with that. And so oftentimes in that context, when you talk about something like consistency, it can feel like this egregious thing that you have to deliver on if you're ever going to get anywhere, kind of, like it's heavy.
Yeah, it's true.
And when I think about consistency, whether it's through the lens of parenting, through the lens of personal growth, something I'm trying to achieve as a business person, I think about the idea of having sort of boundaries for myself, having rules and norms for myself with gray zone. And the reason for that is that life happens.
Yeah.
And if we're not attuned to the need for gray zone, then often what can happen is that we will deplete ourselves because we'll push in a time when we were meant to hold, and we will run out of steam before we've crossed the line. So it's important to have the structure set up and then also to be able to flex inside the structure so that you are adapting to the flow of what is life.
So I'm happy that you expanded a little bit in there on the gray zone. You said flexing a little bit within the boundaries. Is that what the gray zone is? Tell me a little bit more about what that means. For me, that's the first time I'm hearing it.
Yeah.
And I want to know.
So let's put it in the context of my children, who are cut from the same cloth and could not be more unique one to the next. And my eldest son, he was kind of just like happy to be born. And he came into the world, and when it was time to start soccer, he started soccer and it went fine. And when it was time to go to school, he went to school and it went fine. And I was like, well, obviously, because I'm his mother. And then his younger brother was born, and he wasn't super thrilled about being born. He came into the world, he cried for 8 weeks straight. I thought I was going to lose my ever-loving mind. And I realized that he needed things to be quite different than his brother. He was very sensitive to everything going on around him and continued to be that way. I mean, he's still that way present day, but his brain is developed in around that, so he's able to temper it. Now, fast forward to them being in school, and let's say they forgot their PE strip, their gym wear at home.
Or rugby cleats. Yeah, I've heard that one. Yeah.
And when they were little, there was a thing at the school that they went to where if you didn't bring your gym strip, you had to do supervised study, which was sort of a big deal. You have to stay in at lunch. You're sort of like the naughty kid. You get sent off to the principal's office.
Walk of shame.
Right. Yeah. If my older son had called me while I'm at work and I panic, Mom, I forgot my PE strip, blah, 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 blah. The rule kind of is you got to sort yourself out before you leave the house. That's why there's a list beside the front door. Is your bag full of all the things that it needs to be full of? And it might be one of those things where if I'm not able to, without disrupting my client's schedule or whatever else, you're just going to have to carry it, and you're going to have to do some supervised study.
So, yeah.
So that's son number one. son number 2, in the early days, had I done that to him, like we would have spent 3 months recovering from it. It would have been such a colossal thing, and like the bottom of life as we know it would have fallen out of everything for him. And so that's the gray zone. It's like the idea is you're responsible for yourself and for your things. Here's the support structures in place to make that all possible, and we gray zone it when we need to. And so it's about introducing the flex where it's appropriate to have a little bit of give.
Yeah, and thinking about your youngest, I think that when I think of him, I think of how immensely proud he is to uphold expectations people have for him. And that rigid pressure I have seen not always him put on himself, but when expectations or rules are laid out for him, I could see why something like that might give him, let's say, anxiety. I can feel like that a little bit too, just because whether it's approval or something where I just feel like this is something that was expected of me. It can be as simple as not looking at a list when I know I was supposed to. That's something that I always related with in your youngest. Your eldest, how has he helped your youngest? And sort of, you said almost like a yin and yang. How does that work in terms of their sort of partnership, let's say?
Yeah, I think for a lot of years it actually drove my eldest crazy.
Yeah.
That it was,
Poor guy.
it was different, and he was like the golden child who was towing the party line all the time and was putting up with this younger brother who just couldn't, get his poop in a groove.
Yeah.
And what it's morphed into, particularly as I really caretaked of that relationship so that it wouldn't implode, what it's morphed into, they're 20 and 17 now. How is it even possible? Is that the older son he shines light on what is possible,
Yeah.
and he brings a little bit of certainty into the things that feel maybe a little bit out of control in my younger son's view. So he's the older brother that's like, listen, this is just what grade 11 is. And grade 11 is like the most stressful year for most kids. It's the year everybody's talking about grades and uni applications coming up in the next year. And what are you going to do after high school? Grade 11 is the year that it tends to hit. And so as Max has been going through that, he's had this older brother who's like, grade 11, you win some, you lose some.
Yeah, buddy, yeah.
It's 11, just hang in there, man. You just got to get across the finish line. So he's got somebody who's very even-keeled, kind of showing him what that looks like and how it feels, just to sort of settle into that. So it's a great, kind of mentorship that's occurred.
Well, I know that you said it almost jokingly earlier but that is, I've listened to a lot of speeches that you've given. You talk a lot about making choices to evaluate circumstance and see what is within your control. And making choices, you talk a lot about feeling trapped within life and the ability to assess and say what is beyond my control and what can if I'm feeling this way about things beyond my control, why am I not trying to change the way that I am feeling about it? And it sounds like the brothers among them have a very mature, complex sort of ability to address that at 20 and 17. Okay, so my 31-year-old brother and I are just grazing conversations like that. So you should be really proud of that. Stu.
Yes, sir.
Let's talk a little bit about your kids. So you and I had a little bit of an honest conversation before we started filming today. We talked about tantrums. And the question that I asked you was, did any of your kids have tantrums? And before you answered, I did preface, I was a tantrum kid. My brother used to get sent on timeout, and my parents would forget about him because he would just sit on the bed and he would sit silently. Then they had me, and they'd put me on timeout, and that was a notion to me, timeout. I'd say no. And they'd be like, what do you mean no? And I'd say, like, why do I have to stay in the room? And I'd walk myself out. So they'd put Vaseline on the door handle so I couldn't get myself out. So I used to lay at the door and kick it. And oh my God, like, I think about that, and that's my own birth control for a few years. I'm sorry to say, but like, I'm like, I don't want that in my life. Like that, and that's me. Like that, I'm not playing very good odds. Talk to me a little bit about parenting through a time where we could have used more Dr. Vanessa Lapointe's. How did you navigate those big emotions at a time where those resources were less available?
It was tough.
Yeah.
Because I was working and usually traveling around the globe, and
Yeah.
my wife at the time was a single mother, not single mother, but she was a single mother at home, raising these 3 children. And I'd come home from a trip to Asia for a couple of weeks, and all heck would be breaking loose. And there was one time she was so frustrated. She goes, "I found this cure for our oldest son. I'm just going to give him shock therapy." Some sort of newfangled version of shock therapy that they had come up with back in the 80s and or 90s. And then I said, whoa, hold your horses here. That's not going to happen. Yeah. Or he's maybe got some other challenges, yeah. And so put the kibosh on that. But he was a handful, and there was a point where there was some, let's say, some challenging times, yeah. that we were really concerned about. So. Yeah. That was a tough go, but he's turned out well. He's in his 30s now and doing just fine.
So would you say that what was the emotion that you needed to dig deep to bring out in terms of when you hit those challenges with parenting?
Consistency.
Yeah.
Staying calm. Yeah. Which is not always easy as a parent.
Word to your mother.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm in my second family now. I got 2 stepdaughters, teenage stepdaughters, and the second time around is a lot easier than the first time, because the first time you get caught up in the whole emotions around it and you get kind of wound up. Second time is like, I've seen this all before. You go to your room, the mother, you go to your room, and we'll sort this all out. Yeah. It'll all be okay. No one's going to die here. Everyone's going to be happy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, is to make sure you got the consistency and you just stay level-headed.
And you talk I'm learning more about family psychology. You talk in your book, Discipline Without Damage. Led Zygotsky, I can't pronounce his name very well. Is that Zygotsky? Yeah. His theories were about zone of proximity, zone of proximal education. Your children all benefited from you're talking about your calm presence. You're talking about a calm presence for your children who are siblings. It sounds like, and it seems like, it's important to have those different energies around. What do we do about the people who don't have access to those energies and those systems where, someone feels, and that's the thing with mental health, is if you were only, and why it's so great we talk about it, if we were only left with our own experience with mental health, then the way that my cousin would tell me to get over something is just hit the gym the hardest you can. And he looks great, and his mental health is a lot better, and that's worked great for him. I have tried to run until I feel better. It doesn't work. You have to talk to people to make sure you get to that solution. What have you seen in terms of the battle? Because you've been doing your career in the time where mental health has totally revolutionized. What were some of the early battles that you faced where you feel like, oh my God, how is this still popping up in my day-to-day? I started with this. How am I still fighting this? Talking about consistency, what are some of the consistent issues?
Mm-hmm. There's something about, especially for me, about parenting that brought every possible crack, wound, issue, challenge to the surface. And I think that's a journey that a lot of people enter into when they have children. They're like, oh, I thought I was all woke, but check this out. Yeah. I'm the one that's yelling at my children and getting reactive and having my own temper tantrums, but in my grown-up way.
Yeah, true.
And so I think for me, it was about, I swore up and down I was going to do it different than the generation before. I have beautiful parents, my mom and my dad, and they parented as people did in the 70s. That was a different time, and we don't necessarily parent that way anymore. And so I was like, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to level up. And then I would hear my mother or my father coming out my mouth, and I'd be like, I just meditated on this morning. Like, why am I still falling back to or regressing back to those other kinds of habits or patterns?
Sometimes I'm in the car and I say I'm going to go into a conversation a certain way, and then I step out and I just immediately gone. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think what I realized is that it's a inside job always.
Mhm.
You know, whenever we point the finger at all these other things around us that aren't going the way that we think they should, you know, our spouse who's not behaving the way they should, our children who aren't behaving the way they should, the teachers who are doing it all wrong. When we point fingers out there, we have 3 pointing back at ourselves. And so when we can take the finger back and realize that life in the way that we live it is all perception. None of it's real. I mean, there's physically one of me sitting here, but there's actually 2 versions plus my version of me. So there's 3 of me in the room. And what's happening out there has nothing to do with me. I get to choose the lenses that I'm going to wear and the way that I'm going to see the world.
Well, I wish, that is, how do you make a teenager hear that? That, yeah, that is so profound. And like that, you hear something like that and it's a key to a lock, right? Like, and luckily in my sophisticated 28-year-old brain, I hear that. But honestly, I'm going to hear that. And that's something I would have to write down and read to myself every day to remind myself. How does that battle, like, what does that look like in terms of parenting teenagers to teach them, stop hurting yourself like this? How what is the method for both of you guys?
I'll let you answer.
Yeah. Like, I guess through trial and error, what have you found works?
You know, if I were to rewind the clock and think about the various trials and tribulations, my family has restructured, so I'm divorced from my children's father and remarried. And so we went through all of the stuff that comes with that. My youngest son had, you know, a hearing loss and different learning challenges that presented related to that. And there was lots of stress and drama related to all of those things. And as we navigated the various bumps in the road, we'll call them, along the way, there often were discussions that invited reflection. So an example, my son heads off to school. Some of the kids at school have not very nice things to say about him because he's dyslexic and is having a hard time. And he comes home, and of course I hear him in all of that. And then when the conversation is just ripe enough for a little bit of an addition, I might interject something like, and what does that tell us about that child? What do we know about what's true for them? Because if they're saying those things about you, it actually means that they feel something similar to that about themselves on the inside. So always taking it back to that. Or when they were having a really difficult time with their own dad, you know, sometimes he would say and do things that weren't very kind. And of course, I'm not going to make any of that right. I'm going to let them have their frustration about how that didn't feel super great. And then I'm going to invite them to remember the truth about themselves and also the truth about their dad. And why is it that people talk and behave that way? And all of us, and I really believe this, are doing the very best that we can in every given moment, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and with an understanding of the circumstances and places from which we have come. We're all doing our best.
Yeah.
I used to work in child protection, and I can say that about every one of those parents too. And so when we can, you know, raise our children and invite conversations of that ilk, then eventually it starts to circle back around to themselves.
Yeah.
It makes it safer for them to have those sorts of vulnerable discussions about what they maybe need to work on, because we've been having a lot of discussion about that just in terms of life without making anybody wrong along the way.
Something I just revere about you is, for me, in terms of my sort of heritage, oral tradition, passing down lessons from generation to generation is a very Greek thing. I know that there's a lot in terms of what you do in reflection from generations before, even in the way that you reflected on your own parents just a few moments ago. I think about my relationship with my family. I have great parents. The family structure in Greek culture specifically is very linear from like ancestry to grandparents to parents to you. And our role in the family becomes less about listening and more about teaching. I think that is one of the flaws in generational wisdom, is I think active, because what you just described to me, I hear that, and I think of the integral piece being active listening. Do you have any active listening exercises for parents?
Yeah.
Just to be more in tune with things like that, because what you're touching on is perception, and I worry that emotional intelligence, while we all have a natural ability to be more sensitive and less, I guess it's a two-part question. Active listening and emotional intelligence. What are two sort of exercises that we could do to be better about it?
You know, I actually believe with every cell of my being that if every human on the planet learns just one thing, the art of listening, all of the problems that we have, wars, famine, all of those things would go away if we all could figure out how to listen. And active listening, in my view, is giving the other person the experience of feeling seen and heard. It's not making them right. It's not making them wrong. I'm not putting my opinion into the discussion. All I'm doing is giving you the experience of being seen and being heard. And so it basically is, if you were to say to me, so it's all about perception, and I feel like that somehow is connected to emotional intelligence and how people come to know themselves. Did I get that right? Is that what you were saying?
What was the first moment it clicked, like, this might be a calling?
You know, I always loved being around kids. And so when I was a teenager myself, and all of my summer jobs had to do with children, I mostly ran children's day camps. And when I got a little bit older, I paid my way through university teaching kids skating lessons. I was a competitive figure skater growing up. And so I always knew that I loved the energy of children. I loved being around children. I was very interested in like what made a 2-year-old 2 and what made a 6-year-old 6 and what made a 14-year-old 14, you know, like I was always sort of dialed in. And early on, I thought, okay, the thing that I want to do is I want to be kind of clinical about it all. And I want to do these assessments, and I want to be the one that figures out if something's gone sideways for a kid, like what's up? So that was sort of the educational path that I took. And then I became a psychologist, and sort of 1 year into my doctoral program, I discovered, surprise, I was pregnant. And so, yeah, it was one of those. I was like, wait a second, do I have mono, or am I maybe having a baby?
Yeah, absolutely.
One or the other.
So I got through that degree, and I had onboarded all of this information, and simultaneous to that, I had become a parent. And I was like, I don't know if any of this is working. Like all of these theories and all of these ideas that all of these, you know, super smart people have and tell us to do with our children, it seemed a little crackers to me. I wasn't real sure that I'd been given the right message. And so I began almost like a second doctoral program, but in my own time, where I just began deep diving into all of these different sort of theoretical streams to figure out why what I had learned felt at odds with what was actually playing out for me as a parent and for my children. And that, long story short, led to, over the span of about 10 years, a reinvention of how I was doing my work. I became much less focused on the child and much more focused on the parent. I realized that when parents sent their children to me for therapy, it was kind of like an expensive play date. And when the parents brought themselves to therapy with me, then we were cooking with gas. Then it was on, because now we're talking about changing systems, and we're actually impacting the environment, the home, in which the child is marinating. And then from there, I realized, well, I could sit in my office one-on-one with 5 or 6 parents a day, or I can, you know, hit a world stage somewhere and get 2,000 of them in a go. And so I started speaking a lot more and being really active in social media in order to create that connection with what I call the big people. it really is about connecting with the big people in the lives of children, whether it's parents or coaches or grandparents or teachers, whatever your big person role is, that's actually where we shift systems. That's where we change the reality of a child. And, I've now been able to work with families where I might not even meet their children, and we'll get like a suicidal, self-harming teen to walk right out of their bedroom and back into their life. And so the power of setting up the environment for a child in a way that really works for them is miracle creating.
So that even gives me more emotion, because now there's juxtaposition between that and what you said a little bit earlier, which is the moment you realized that it was an expensive play date. That hurts me to hear. How did that moment strike you when it sort of dawned on you that, oh my God, I go in with this intention, and you talked about it earlier, being in control of the things you can change. Did that feel like a burden or a sense of guilt at all? Or I don't want to project anything, but
I was a little worried. I'd, spent 13 years at university and had ended up in the wrong career. Because I started to feel like I would actually do a disservice to those children if I were to work with them. The idea that, it's sort of the like, here, fix them mentality. And kids don't grow up in a vacuum. And never, I've worked with parents, as I mentioned earlier, in the child protection system, and who have arguably done terrible things to their children. And yet I haven't ever met a parent who set about life intending to do wrong by their kids. I've met a lot of parents whose kids have really unique constitutions, and then they're like, it's not working the way that we thought it would work, So it's not that people actively try to mess it up for their children, and that oftentimes they end up feeling like they're in a tidal wave of this isn't working. And so if I buy into the rhetoric of here, fix the kid, then I just send that child back home to all the same stuff. Like, you might as well just like throw your money in the fireplace and burn it. You're not going to get any further ahead. And so it was a real coming to Jesus moment of having to think about, okay, how do I stay aligned and true to myself and resonant with those beliefs? And of course, I following that really took on all of the research that would suggest that maybe was the right way to go.
I was going to say, what was the first step you took following that feeling? Like, what was the tangible change that you then said, I am leaving this process to tweak it? And what was that first tweak? Was it the research, would you say?
It was definitely the research, definitely getting real about the why and all of that. Like, why was the way that I was trained, which I'll classify as a behaviorist kind of approach, why was that so at odds with the way that I was leaning towards, which I'll classify as a developmental approach. And so where was the mismatch? Like, how come this was news to me? Where had I missed it in my formal training? And to be honest, a lot of that came to life for me in my role as a mom. It wasn't so much professionally, it was personally. And once your eyes have seen it, once your heart knows it, you can't unknow it. You can't unsee it. You can't unbe that. And so from there was just sort of no turning back.
So I wish that I had your charisma. I wish.
I love that you think you don't.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate that.
You did pretty well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I feel like, let's say there's somebody who feels exactly like you about their passions, but they don't have the ability to. Well, everyone has the ability, but getting on stage or speaking about it is challenging. What advice would you give for young researchers for that portion of it? How can you be tenacious like you are in advocacy? Let's say dedicated 100% to the research portion of it. Not that you weren't, but you are an energizer bunny. You go all day, every day. And what does the research dedication part look like?
I think that when you line up, I talk sometimes about the concept of dharma, like that we all come into this world and we all have something to give it. Yeah. And your job is to figure out what is that. Yeah. And the more that you step towards the path that aligns with the truth of who you are and what you're meant to be expressing in this thing called life, you'll feel it. Like, and whether it's, you know, my son, the musician, whether it's figuring out a way to explore his craft and how he brings that alive in the world, and what's it going to look like, and whose heart is it going to touch, and whose life is it going to change. There's something important about that. And so how do you figure out what those pathways are, and how do you explore the meaning in that for yourself so that you can live an aligned kind of life? I would hate, like, if I think about my dreams for my own children, the idea that they would live out the rest of their days like grinding at a 9 to 5 that they don't feel lit up by.
Yeah.
What a horrible.
It's like a death sentence. It is, right?
You have to find a way to be alive in what it is that you're doing, whether you're making money at that or not. Maybe you got to do something different to make some money, but be alive in what it is that
follow
you're
your dreams a little bit, right?
That's
Yeah.
true. But, you know, I was very fortunate that even there's an element of me being here where, you know, your family business, Stu, 1978, right?
Almost
Wow.
50 years, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same year my family started their business too, which is hilarious, funny coincidence. But yeah, I think that maybe on behalf of your children, I'll say that we have all the opportunity. I know I do, and I know your children. You've all given us our opportunities to have that success. And so, Stu, your upbringing, it was a little bit different than things are now for Jay in our home. Do you want to talk about how the landscape has maybe changed a little bit?
Well, I mean, I'm turning 60 this year, so
We're going to cut that part out. All right? Yeah. Beat that out. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
A lot of things have changed, but, you know, the business started almost 50 years ago, and it was my father started the business in the house, and I lived in the basement. And then when I took off to university, he moved more of the business into my bedroom and said, "See you later." And then I went off to university and you know, got a couple degrees, and then came back to the family business that I never said I would do, but I did anyways. And then I started to find the path. And you know, in business, there's ups and downs and sideways, as you know, in your family business. But you know, we've been fairly successful. We've got people, a couple hundred people across the country, have offices globally, and I travel globally. And I see a whole bunch of different things. And to the one point you brought up earlier was, if you could make everyone in the world just listen and be more, look after each other. I mean, I was like recently in Vietnam, South Africa, so different parts of the globe, and there's just different dynamics there. It's sad to see. I mean, it really would be nice if we just all got along.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, even for things like, so you talk about a lot about eco-friendly initiatives, recycling initiatives, whatnot. So when Stu first brought me on board, it was to find recycling programs across the country. And I thought that was going to be like the most uplifting thing ever, to just like call provinces, to get in touch with their governments and be like, hey, what exciting things are you doing to care about the future? And anyways, Saskatchewan's government answers me and says, it's no matter what you give us, we're going to put it in a landfill. Don't call back. Pretty much hang up on me. So I'm figuring out that in some of the work that you've had to be doing, there's a lot of tenacity involved in it in terms of advocacy. Because what Stu's, to talk about turning 60 again, he approached me and kind of how we started working together is he used a word that really tapped into my pathos, which is legacy. And he said, I want to figure out the legacy portion of my career. And sorry to touch on that, but right now there's, besides siblings, no children in the family business.
Correct.
And I just sort of made some life changes and moving on from my family business. So Stuart and I basically started working together. And that actually brings us to these. So these are the chairs I was telling you about. These are made out of the recycled plastic, and these are actually, this is recyclable material, recyclable plastic, made out of recycled plastic.
That's amazing.
And so, yeah, we have these selling all over, and it's, I don't know, Stu, right now we're finding some success in these, but Stu knows that it's kind of an investment right now ahead of time.
We have to get better. We have to get better for ourselves and better for the world. I mean, I've walked down beaches in Vietnam, and I try and go for a swim, and it's like plastic everywhere. It's just.
And that's what I was thinking about the listening thing, is like, you wish that people would listen.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just something that we've been facing a lot of issues with, in terms of, we wish people cared maybe a little bit more than.
You know, I think there's something in that about vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because if somebody says, this isn't really working out for us here. We need to change this.
Yeah.
For somebody to receive it and be like, great idea, let's do that. There's a real vulnerability in it.
Isn't it a good idea though?
It's a wonderful idea.
I thought
brilliant
so. Yeah,
idea.
thanks.
And actually really beautiful.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
And to admit that change is what's needed. You have to admit that what is currently happening is not working and or wrong.
That's a vulnerable thing.
It creates dissonance for people. Either I have to like shift to this new way of being and sort of give up this old way of being and admit my error and my wrongness, or I just stay married to this and I don't shift ever. It's interesting that there's all these layers of just human psychology, social psychology, in an initiative about making the world a better place.
So something just clicked in me and why I agree with so much of what you say. The Greek in me is a philosopher. You have so much philosophy infused in the things you say. And what would you say, what portion of psychology is philosophy or religion? Is it all kind of fused together? Are there pieces that it's kind of broken into like that? Is that a question people ask? I don't know.
I'm smiling as you're asking it, because if you had asked this of me like 20 years ago, I'd be like, none. Like, we just do the science and we get the data and then we like bring it to bear on the people.
Idiot. Yeah.
And now, almost 25 years later, I would say to you, here's what psychology should be. Psychology should be like 99% philosophy and balanced with like equal measure of maybe not religion, but spirituality. In fact, all of the more recent literature, peer-reviewed literature, looking at resilience, which is sort of a buzzy kind of topic these days. I wonder why, COVID and all the things.
Yeah.
When you look at the literature on resiliency, there's a number of things. If kids have a big person who's been on their side, who thinks the sun rises and sets on them, they'll be resilient. And there's sort of a list of kind of 3 or 4 different things that continuously show up in those papers. But one of those 3 or 4 things is always spirituality, that you have a belief in something bigger. You don't have to, it doesn't need to be God, it doesn't need to be whatever entity, but the idea that the universe is at your back and is carrying you in this thing called life to a greater or lesser extent. Spirituality is a big part of that. And I have, ironically, at this stage in my career, become very, I really question the practice of psychology. I think it's full of a lot of people who are well-intentioned, and I think more times than not, they do harm rather than help. And it's because the focus is on the wrong things. There isn't a broad enough lens in terms of understanding the impact of systems, and that we get really down the rabbit hole of navel gazing as opposed to understanding the complexity of who we are as humans and how it all actually works.
But that again comes down to vulnerability. And I think that another reason why I compare it to philosophy is I think about all of my favorite philosophers, and talking about Men's Health Awareness Month. I think I might have talked about this. One of my favorite philosophers to read is Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was, he wrote a lot basically in his meditations about how not to perceive people, and you talked about this too, not to perceive people as evil, and that understanding you're gonna stumble across every type of person that day, and not to take those things personally. But also, more than that, being a man, which I hope that it's okay to say that, being a good man is about being able to change your beliefs. And it is as manly to listen and morph as it is more manly than sticking to your ground and saying, no, planting myself will make me stronger than listening. I don't get a whole lot of listening from, growing up, I didn't get a whole lot of listening from my male role models. And that is something that I feel like I have. I see, I related it to when you said, I see my parents doing certain, or I see my parents and myself. There's times where I'm coaching or whatever it is, and I excuse an outburst of anger because I've had a day, right? They don't know all the crap that I've dealt with before now and this and that. And then you find out something about one of their days or something that's going on at home, a parent's sick, a grandparent passed away. Perspective and vulnerability has come through humiliation. Do you find that that's a trend with men?
Yes, I think that, none of us are lining up at therapists' doors or really doing deep inner work to explore our woundedness and where we've come from when everything's great.
Yeah.
We tend to do that work when we've been brought to our knees and have to figure out how we're going to find our way forward again.
Yeah.
And I think for men in particular, it just seems like it has to be so bad before the path becomes an option to do it differently. And I think, like, what a wonderful thing it would be for that to change. My second husband, who's somebody that's done years and years of very deep inner work and continuously is working on himself through various personal growth kinds of models. I remember him telling me rather early on in our dating experience how he had to learn to cry. As a 54-year-old man, he had to learn to cry because he lost his tears as a 4-year-old. The saddest thing that a human being doesn't get to be the fullest expression of who it is that they are. And he didn't come to that lightly. Like, he wasn't like waltzing through his career and waltzing through his glorious marriage and waltzing through, the brilliant development of his children. He was running into brick walls in some of those areas. Yeah. And it was only when he was brought to his knees that he really decided, okay, I'm going to do something different.
Do men cry?
Stu, yeah, go on. Yeah. We're working on this.
I've learned a lot too, right? I mean,
men supporting men to be vulnerable and to embrace the idea that they're like emotional human beings and welcome to being alive.
Yeah.
What a wonderful thing.
It's a novel experience. I think it was 54 when I first had my first cry too.
Oh yeah.
Really? You think so, actually?
I'm about 54.
Yeah, something like that. It was tough.
Do you believe there's any merit to negative visualization? Let's not call it negative visualization, but that is a practice that I know some philosophers talk about, is thinking about concepts like, as grim as it is, death. Thinking about, okay, if this happens, like something terrible, like eventually, my parents are going to pass. As horrible as that is to say out loud, where do you recommend preparing for things like that? The brutal aspects of things to come. That's a hard question, I know.
It makes me think about, when you're learning to drive, there's like an effect where the car will go where your eyes are. Yeah. And so why you're meant to have your eyes on the road. And actually, when Max was learning to ride his bike, he was 5 years old. Yeah. And so we're doing the whole thing where he's, down the sidewalk and I'm running after him trying to keep up, and he keeps steering into the road like this. And I said to him, baby, you got to look where you're going. Yeah. And he's like, I am. But he's got his eyes up in the sky. And I'm like, no, you got to look where you're going, where you want the bike to go. He said, I am, Mama. I'm going to Venus. That was he was like, what is the problem here, lady? That's right. And I think, the way that I would answer that is life is a little bit of two things. One is, you have to have vision and really create for where it is that you want to go. You don't have a family business that's lasted this long if you haven't been sort of directing and channeling towards the things that are your Venus, whatever that might be.
Looking ahead, podcast name. Yeah, exactly.
And having said that, you hope for the best and plan for the worst. And whatever the worst is, when it doesn't have control over you, when it doesn't grip you, when it doesn't confine you, then your freedom in terms of being able to get to Venus will be unleashed. And so, how do you get comfortable with those things that feel so heavy and so dark and not let that control you?
Do you have a simple method for diagnosing if something should control you or not? If you should have staked emotion in it? Is there a simple...
I would believe that nothing should control you.
There you go. Good answer.
You know, have you read Viktor Frankl, Men's Search for Meaning?
No, I haven't.
Your next read.
There you go.
You are welcome. Hear me now, thank me later.
On our next episode with her, we'll make sure to follow up that conversation.
And Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist and ended up in a concentration camp.
Oh, geez.
And he saw the plight of the men around him who were, you know, falling to the ground and dying. And he decided that he was either going to live or he was going to die. And he goes about describing how all of life is perception. Nothing out there is real unless you make it be so. And that he was going to perceive this differently. And that's the book from which this famous quote comes: between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is your power to choose. And in that choice lies your freedom. And so we get to decide, you know, what we're going to give energy to and what we're not going to give energy to. And my experience has been, when I do that really consciously, when I shift out of, you know, focusing on the dark, the negative, the awful, the dreary, and I just get busy living, whatever that is, tends to morph and become alive and new in a different way.
That's really interesting. I feel like maybe a lot of men feel like that. Stu, the gentlemen in your generation, what do you wish that they heard about this conversation right now?
All of it.
Yeah, fair.
No, it's amazing and enlightening.
Yeah. But what would you say in terms of, like, even just like us being at the family restaurant of mine together, bar talk, what's some things that even in this, like, maybe we should normalize?
Maybe we should normalize. That's a good question. I think, again, I keep coming back to doing the right things for yourself and for each other, and making sure that you try and just be a better person every day. Do better for the globe, as we're trying to do with our products, right? So I think that gives you a good inner sense of that you're heading in the right direction. So I think, you know, we continue to try and just be better for ourselves, for people around us, for the earth we live on. I think it's enlightening.
What does it feel like in terms of, how would you, for yourself, when your compass, because talked about kind of navigating that compass, what does it feel like for you when you feel that compass start to get blurry? And how do you reorient it for both of you guys?
Go for a run.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's a huge thing. I've been studying DBT therapy, and using stimulations like exercise, cold showers. Those are things that are actual treatments. So that is a good answer. A lot of men say that.
It's helped me through my life, and I've run numerous marathons over the years.
What is it about the running, would you say?
It just clears your mind from all the noise. There's a lot of noise in our worlds today, and when you just get on the road and start breathing and sweating, and
do you feel like you're pushing ahead or leaving things behind?
I would say a little bit of both, but probably more leaving them behind.
Interesting. Yeah. What about for you, Dr. Vanessa? What's your...
You know, I would say it's a mix of things for me. And I don't think it's ever done. Like, I'm never going to be at that point where I'm like, compass is clear, going to stay that way for the next 50 years until I sweetly pass on to the next world. So there's a day-to-day kind of thing that I do. I'm also physically quite active because it keeps me sane and keeps me grounded just in my day-to-day life. I have some personal growth stuff that I do every day, ways that I wake up in the morning, ways that I go to bed at night that have to do with connecting back to my core. So I have sort of daily upkeep stuff that I do in order to keep myself kind of grounded day to day. And when things have gotten noisy for me, and I must admit to you, I'm like a dog with a bone. It's hard to get me to stop. I like came out of the womb ready to go. If you ask my dad, he will tell you that I was brought out of the delivery room and presented to him. He was a chef at the time, and a bunch of guys from the restaurant were in the hallway. And he says I came out, and I was like smiling at them all, like, hey,
how you doing, boys?
And so it's very hard for me to hear the whispers.
Yeah.
When it's time to slow down, when it's time to regroup, those kinds of things. And normally I wait for calamity to strike, and then I create room. And whether it's 2 weeks away, or it has been part of my career trajectory where I've taken 4 months off or 6 months off just to dial in again and get clear about what's the path and how am I meant to be walking it.
Between the two of you, I like that it was very different answers. How can I come to the table, not as a rugby coach, not as a employee? How do you go out there and just make sure that you are that person that is safe for people?
I'm very invested in the concept of the otherness of the other.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So if somebody, and it's happened where I've been in a public venue and somebody in the audience is upset by something that I've said. It's at odds with their style. It's at odds with something they believe in. And I often have a question and answer period at the end of my public speaking events. And so it'll come out that happens. And if I were to be at the effect of what that person is saying as they report their ego to me, and if I were to pick up what they were putting down, then I have onboarded the other into myself. When I can understand the otherness of the other, that is that person comes into this situation preloaded with all of the stuff that then creates their words, creates their vision, creates their perception of whatever is happening in the moment.
I guess to provoke further question, what are, like, when I think about the things, because I'm trying to do my part in talking to my guy friends about therapy, counseling, and all that. Most of the things that they'll go about is mental health as an extension of a lot of their relationships with their significant others or what being cheated on. In the conversations I have with women and who are actively participating in counseling therapy, a lot of the things that they go to talk to counselors in therapy in context of men is for a diverse range of things, whether it's like a workplace relationship or something that is oppressive or abusive or frightening. I feel like the capacity in which men go to therapy to resolve issues with women is very romantic, lustful, sexual, almost the aspects they're trying to heal. I guess what I'm trying to find is, like, where can men in their therapy have more education about mindfulness in the...
Well, be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
It's about how are you going to show up? How are you shining light? What kind of energy are you bringing to that? Are you speaking truth?
Yeah.
So when, there's a homophobic comment or a racial slur or something against women, like, are you like, hey, not on my watch, we're not doing that, clean it up? And are you able, second to that, but like a slim margin second, are you able to see through it? Are you able to see, that's all ego. That has nothing to do with the truth of that person. They acquired that belief system. They acquired that fear-based mentality that is fueling this hatefulness and vitriol. They've acquired it somewhere along the way. When they were born into the world, they were this sweet, innocent little babe who didn't know any different. So can we see through the ego to the truth of who they are? And the truth of who somebody is, who's, either being hateful towards women, a racist, homophobic, whatever it is, the truth of who they are is they have fear in them and a lack of connection with themselves around similar things. The theme might be, what if I don't fit in? If I onboard a big fear, if that's like a big narrative of mine and it's a big wound that I've carried through my life, I can't fit in, I don't belong, then I'm going to look for everybody out there who can't fit in and doesn't belong, and I'm going to call them out. And so it's projection. All of relationship, everything about how we see another person, how we interact with other people, is about how we take our shit. Am I allowed to swear on this?
Yeah, of course,
Okay. How we take our shit and project it all over other people. It's like you're just a big white blank slate and I like roll tape, in order to have myself play out there so I don't actually have to take a look at what's underneath the surface here. So I think for men to be change makers, to be light makers in the world for other men, you get real about those things for yourselves. And if you want to level up on that, then you start guiding other men about how they can follow suit.
And again, I said I wouldn't direct the conversation back to your children, but I have seen Max stand up to bullies. I have seen him stick up for himself. And I am fortunate that I've had enough mentorship in my life where I was taught staying silent in a room of bullies isn't good enough. You have to, because otherwise, when a story is told, they're going to say you were in the room, and it won't matter that you stayed silent. It's going to hurt somebody. The only way you can absolve yourself is to make sure that you say the right thing, that you think is the right thing. The problem with me is that is subjective, and I have been wrong about when I think it is the time to say the right thing. I have met moments with so much conviction. Forgiveness, that's a really tough one. Especially in Greeks are grudge holders, very, very good at it. Sometimes it goes for hundreds of years, right? Like we still don't talk to Turkey very much, and they sorry, that's geopolitical. We shouldn't do that on here. But I mean, obviously it's not a me thing, but it's just, I don't know, forgiveness. Any tools for that?
Forgiveness is for you. It's not for the other person.
Yeah.
It's not up to anybody else. Like if you have wronged another, they don't need to absolve you of that. They have no responsibility in the transaction at all. It's your own responsibility to atone or become at one around the grievance. So if I yelly shout at my children, I would never go to my children and say, "Can you forgive me?"
Jeez, yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
If I was awful to my husband, I wouldn't go to my husband and say, "Can you forgive me?"
That's a burden, yeah.
Because now he'll be like, "Fine."
Yeah.
Like, and the reason that we do that, we go to others and ask for forgiveness, is we want them to absolve us of what we've done. Instead, when we can come into that as the, one who was the aggressor or whatever the problem was, if we can come into that and just own it and be at one with the other. And so I would play that out by saying something like, "I don't love that I was like a grumpy mom this morning. It's not the way that I want to do this. And I want you to know that I'm aware and that I'm working on it and that I love you." And I think what's interesting about the sort of nature of the conversation that we're having about all of that, it doesn't mean that you just sit down and be like, "Okay, be an asshole, take me down." You don't. It's that how you step in terms of taking a stand and declaring what's right and disallowing somebody to transgress a personal boundary, how you step in around those things rather than being full of middle finger salutes. It's just full of power. There's a difference between power and force. And to be able to step into those kinds of situations and like take a stand for what's right and what's just, and do so with power, which comes from the truth, from the core of who you are, as opposed to being reactive, which then we go to force, which is where we're going to shame and blame and manipulate in kind in order to try and get people to stand down. Power, nobody can push back against.
So to kind of relate it to Stuart again, with what we're trying to do you think that in terms of us and our message, it would be authenticity in our care of what we're talking about in environment, recycling, sustainability? Is that how do we make that traction that you have made in your field in our conversation?
I don't know, and I would say authenticity. I'd say humility. That none among us are perfect, and we're all just trying to figure it out and put our best foot forward. I would say the power to listen, because what you're asking of people is for them to be incredibly vulnerable in admitting a wrong in order to morph it into a right.
That we can't sustain society the way that we have been operating in terms of manufacturing and supply chains. Like, Stu, you talk about driving through China and how you wish that people would change. You talked about the image you painted of the plastic bottles in the ocean as you drove by, you said it was a sea of, you don't see the sea, it's a sea of plastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Devastating.
Yeah. So that's, when we talk to our customers, Walmart's, Home Depot's, Costco's, Amazon's, everyone gets it. They know that we've got a problem, but we just got to close the loop. They love looking at this stuff. It's great stuff. But now we need to get it from where it is today in someone's yard or deck to being ground up somewhere to be able to close a loop. And that's where we're kind of running into a little bit of frustration, if you want to call it that.
And that's just it, so we're at the point in society where like we have manufacturers, and I wish we were the only ones making these. There's a few other, but we're making the best ones, obviously. So we were like, okay, so we've done this really great thing in creating recyclable furniture. So Stu says, get on the phone, find those programs. Guess how many provinces in Canada had programs able to accommodate items of this size?
Hell.
Do you want to actually guess? Like, do you want to hear, or?
You know what? It's good to know where we've begun, so that we can celebrate where we're going.
Yeah, it's 0. So the number's 0. Wow. So so we have this stuff out there. It's for sale. And now it's at a point where Stu, to be honest, is spending a little extra money, and we're both working a little extra we're trying to manage a lot on the go, this podcast, the manufacturing of it. And we have a whole other conversation and dialogue going with Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Environment and the federal government, trying to figure out initiatives for things like this. And luckily there is you said it, there's a lot of vulnerability from a lot of those retailers and partnerships. It's just, I think, letting it percolate. But unfortunately, like we said, humiliation is something that teaches us, and losing. I'm worried that it's going to be a revelation or rapture that comes that makes us go, okay, we need to start building that ark and getting 2 animals at a time on there. And I wish that, I don't know. I think about you as a pathfinder and an innovator. And like I've said,
that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
We're trying to be innovators and a pathfinder around what we're, taking stuff out of landfills.
Yeah.
So, but it's just, it's a hard environment to get through.
Yeah. And quite literally, in the terms of like, let's break that down, like the words pathfinder, we haven't found the path yet. Like that is literally what we are in the midst of trying to do. And these dialogues, like we hope on this show to have as many different guests as we can from different backgrounds, who all have one thing in common: they're pushing their fields ahead. And everything that you talk about, it in some context involves thinking about the outcome of your actions and how they might affect other people. You are constantly in touch with the things that might come because of the things you are being. That is, for us, a compliment we want to sincerely give you, and why you're here. It is working, the message that you're spreading out there and the love that you're giving. And I know that your clinic, the North Star Clinic, is doing very, very well. That's out in our neck of the woods, isn't it? Very nice. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that. When did that start?
Yes, I opened the doors of that clinic in 2007. We rebranded about a year ago to incorporate some changes in terms of allowing our team more flexibility in how they're working and these kinds of things. And also, truth be told, because the classic approach to psychology is something that I am increasingly at odds with, as you've probably gathered from the flavor of this discussion. And so really working still to refine that so that it's aligned with the way that I think it ought to be going. And, in all of that, and hearing what you guys are up to and creating for out in the world, it's about, like, how do we do all of that? I have big concerns about the field of psychology and the concerns that it's making children sick in ways that they don't need to be, that it's actually creating problems as opposed to illuminating solutions. And if I lead with fear in the way that I am stepping forward around that, I will blow it all up. But if I lead with love and step forward with the sort of energy that comes with love, then sky's the limit. And so, it's razor's edge at any given moment, whether we're tipping to love or tipping to fear. And so how do you, I mean, what you're talking about are important things that are significant and can change the course of like future. I mean, it's no big deal. It's no pressure. So how do you lead with love when it's very easy to go to fear? Like, you know, build the ark. It's, of course, it's easy to go to those kinds of thoughts. How do you lead with love? What would love do? What would love say? How would love be?
Love is a difficult feeling to tap into when you're at your lowest. Do you have any last resorts to look around, and is it just like present mindfulness to hear the birds? That works for me sometimes, but
yeah, grounding, getting back into the present moment. There's activities that you can do around that. There's one called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 things you see, 5 things you hear, 5 things you feel. Like, I feel my shoe on my foot. I feel the hair brushing the side of my face.
Sweaty palms.
All of it,
Just
right?
kidding.
5 things you see, 5 things you feel, 5 things you hear, 4 things you see, 4 things you feel, 4 things you hear. And by the time you've worked yourself down to 1, you're here. When you're in anxiety or alarm, you're in the future. When you're in regret and depression, you're in the past. So be right here. Just be here right now. And when we can get you here right now, then you can start walking yourself out of, I mean, the lowest of the low is shame. That's the lowest form of energy that any of us can feel. And so to elevate up out of shame, how do you do that? And sometimes community is necessary. You know, the University of Alberta has an actual library of hope. So all that exists in this library are books and peer-reviewed literature on the power of hope. And the brain chemicals that shift inside a person when somebody else, like a coach Nico, walks up to you and says, I believe in you. I know you're going to do it. I know you're going to get there. I know what's going to happen for you. And there's something about that if you're hanging on by your fingernails, you can grip, you know, those 10 extra seconds that are going to be required until somebody lifts you up over the edge. So community and being able to be present in the moment.
So in both, one of the things I love to brag about you is that you are a 2-time best-selling author. In both of your books, it is, I said it earlier, it is, don't tell me, the other one is the Parenting Right from the Start.
Nice.
And Discipline Without Damage. Neuroplasticity is something you touch on and always have touched on. For the casual audience member, tell us a little bit of a definition.
Neuroplasticity is the brain's openness to external influence in terms of how it is wired up. And so when we speak about that in terms of child development, of course, children come into the world with a certain kind of temperament on board, and their brains are waiting to be wired up. The human infant is born with a brain that weighs 25% of its eventual adult size. And by the time that baby reaches their 2nd birthday, that brain will have grown to 75% of its eventual adult size. Jeez. We used to think that brain was onboarding 700 new neural connections per second, but we've now adjusted that number to 1 million new neural connections per second.
I don't know what either of those numbers mean, but that sounds like a big difference.
Someone's getting smart young.
And so the idea is that, especially in the early years, and you may have heard the catchphrase, the early years last forever, because especially in the early years, with such rapid growth happening between sort of 0 and 8 years of age, the brain, because it's changing so rapidly, it's basically folding in the environment. And so whatever experiences the brain is having, those are going to get soaked on up into the brain and become part of what drives the neural architecture of how the brain goes and grows. So when a baby cries, do we leave it to cry? Or do we have somebody respond and settle the baby? So think about the baby cries, the emotional parts of the brain are all fired up. And if we just leave them there, then what does it grow? Nothing. But the baby cries, a grown-up comes in and settles the baby. Now what has grown? The first inklings of the capacity for internal self-regulation. You want to be a grown-up who's not at the effect of stress. You want to be a grown-up who knows how to manage anger. you want to be a grown-up who knows how to deal with sort of the ups and downs in life, then it would be ideal that in your childhood, you were gifted the experiences of that so that your brain could onboard those experiences. Now, what's really cool about science is we used to think, and in fact, I remember my very first assessment class in 1993, and I was told, by about age 12, the door is closed. The brain doesn't change after age 12. We know that nothing could be further from the truth. So the brain continues to be open to external influence, neuroplasticity, across the lifespan. But here's the catch. The more rapidly the brain is developing, the more open it is to that external influence. As the brain heads into adulthood, for women it happens around age 25, for men around age 30 is when the brain reaches full maturity. From that point forward, it's still, new neurons, ditching old neurons, figuring out what neural circuits are being used and should be housed and which ones aren't being used, and maybe we get rid of those. It's still changing, but it's at a much slower pace. So the moral or the bottom line is that every single one of us can rewire it. If we are having a big problem with emotional regulation, you can rewire that. You can rewire that when you're 97. It's just that the older you are, the longer and steeper the climb will be.
Is there certain catalysts that you find in adult lives serve as something that gives them the ability to be more, I don't know, would you say neuroplastic, or what is the verb?
Yeah, in adulthood, it's going to depend on the physical reality that the brain is not growing as quickly, but a catalyst for that can be relationship. And so when you have somebody in your corner who believes in you, and not just lip service, but really believes in you and is really there for you and really supporting you, then it's almost like you open it up a little bit. Because I always think about when you're being supported, the person supporting you becomes like this backbone, and you get to just kind of rest a little bit, and then the brain gets to go and grow. And so when we are in rest and digest kinds of phases, we're a lot more open to that kind of physical shifting and growing. When we are flooded and overwhelmed and panicked and not doing well, we're going to be less about that.
So with that being said, guys, I think that's good. If you guys have any other questions, I don't want to take any more of your time, but
I'm good. Are you good?
Great.
I'm better than great. I'm perfect. I'm looking
Turn
ahead.
30.
I'm looking ahead at 30. That's exactly it. Thank you so much, guys. Dr. Vanessa, thank you again. And we'll see you again next time, guys.